Hello and welcome to Why Postliberalism Failed. My name is James Patterson. With me, as always, is Thomas Howes. We have our recording right now is on August 16, 2024. We're both pretty tired today. We're resuming the semester, so I've had deadlines to submit syllabi and all these other things that I've had to do. So if I'm low energy, all right, that's the reason for it. Thomas, however, is a young man, spry, and energetic by nature. So it will not be as noticeable for him. So how are you doing, Thomas?
Also very tired, but we'll get through it. I'm excited to hear about the integralists that you've been studying. Are we at?
Yeah,
We're not at Franco yet, huh? We're doing Brazil.
we're keeping the people waiting on
Okay.
Franco because Franco's probably going to be a few episodes. I'll be
Yeah.
honest. It's a lot. We've both been enjoying in a very odd way the book Anatomy, not Anatomy of a Dictator. What is it? That's the Franco book by uh Mordialis or something like that. I can't quite see the name of the author who wrote it. Which is the one? Is Anatomy of Terror
Oh, gosh.
by Paul Preston? Oh man,
I,
that
I
book by itself requires its own podcast. I have it
yeah,
over
I'm
here in
gonna
my
try to get
bag,
him,
but
see if he wants to come on here and talk about it.
yeah. Do you think we could do that?
Might as well try.
Oh my gosh, where is it? I hope I didn't leave it at home.
I think he's a little bit to the left of us and a little bit friendlier with the Republic than we are. But when he talks, he establishes everything he claims about Franco in the book.
Yeah, well, he doesn't have to agree with us on politics. He's just a good scholar. But
Yeah.
these are some of the hits we'll be talking about. It's more Dielos, maybe is how to say but it's Architects of Terror, and it's not Anatomy of Terror, it's Architects of Terror, which is a funny little pun. Um, because of all the Judeo-Masonic conspiracy theories and
Oh,
the Masonic idea of God as the architect of the universe. He's doing a little thing there.
and I've noticed Maritain's come up a couple times in there because the Francoists really hated Maritain.
They all did. All
Yeah.
these guys hated Maritain, and that's what's funny is Maritain will come up when we do Argentina too.
Oh wow.
Maritain, takes to heart Pius XI's condemnation of Action Française and begins to think seriously about what that condemnation means. But all the reactionaries that were AF because they were like anti-Semites or weirdos are furious with him for not holding the line. And so like Maritain becomes this bête noire for them, which is why whenever you read people criticizing his personalism, normally in the translation, it's like, oh well, what works did they not translate? And then there's something really crazy. Uh, so my favorite example of this is we had a recent, I think the integralists, modern sort of like neo-integralists, were celebrating the republication of Father Julio Maineville's um, takedown of personalism. And the thing about Maineville's takedown, this guy's an Argentinian priest,
Mhm.
is that it's tied to his other major work, which was The Jew, the Mystery of History, which is exactly what you think it is.
Oh,
And he was wrapped in with Hugo Vost and all these other Argentinian anti-Semites that are, a major part of the Argentinian integralists that momentarily secure a position in the Argentine government before General Ramirez and then Juan Perón kicked them to the curb for being bad for business. So that's a different podcast, but
yeah, it's very
uh,
interesting that the over at Josias now the Josias is a blog for integralists. That's I think it's run by Potter Edmund.
that's right.
And I was looking at an old blog post from like 8 or 9 years ago, and Potter Edmund discovered that famous manuscript by what's his name, uh, De Koning, right, against the
Yeah,
personalists. Everybody takes it as opposed to Maritain, even though he never mentions Maritain in the in the book. But Potter Edmund discovered that it was also opposed to Garrigou-Lagrange. And
Yeah.
Garrigou-Lagrange held the basically, now Garrigou-Lagrange, I have some strong political disagreements with Garrigou-Lagrange, but regarding this issue of like personalism and the common good, he actually held the position of Maritain before Maritain did.
Yeah, Maritain, of course, gets into it with Garrigou-Lagrange, who says it's a mortal sin not to support Vichy, right?
Yeah, no, just Garrigou-Lagrange jumped the shark with politics, but on
It's a
some of those,
problem.
he actually agreed with Maritain.
Yeah, a lot of the clergy are bad at politics and think it's just a one-to-one application of theological principle to political party or policy, and it never works that way. I
Mhm.
remember speaking to a really great scholar who was a big fan of Garrigou-Lagrange, and I brought this up with him, and he had never heard of this.
Hmm.
So it's one of these selective forgettings that you find among integralists. I think he's like sympathetic with them, where a lot of them don't actually know this stuff because people who are teaching them don't bring it to their attention, and it's not the kind of thing that you're going to find if you're spending most of your time working in primary and secondary sources on 20th century neo-Thomism and stuff like that. Doesn't come up all that much in theological work. So I brought this to his attention, and he thought the letter was fake.
Wow.
I was like, buddy, no.
Well, that's a
No.
big issue with post-liberals in general, is they tend to be very much people who read primary texts or secondary texts, but they are not very deep in history to give the context, like to understand the context in which texts were written. And that seems to be a major problem with them across the board, even with Deneen. Deneen is famously just does not take context into consideration at all. He's solely focused on big texts like great books and all of that. And
Yeah, it's tedious because you'll bring up the fact that these people have some pretty nasty positions they take, and this is something I wrote my Law and Liberty piece on Deneen's like recommendation of the three authoritarians, two of whom were anti-Semitic, and we talked about this in the Kevin Valier episode. So it's out now, and I was revisiting this problem you're describing, where it's like, man, like my guess is Deneen read the true and only whatever of wealth. What's it called? I'm tired, so I can't remember the name of anything. Anyway, it's some translation of Bonald's work, and of course Sur le Juice is not in there. They're not translating his his bilious condemnation of the Jews of Alsace for placing the Alsatian the nobility under the Judaizing usurious slavery that they would place the rest of the nation under. That's not really a hit.
Yeah, no, and really, and we feel I feel bad that people think that we were ever accusing Deneen of being an anti-Semite. We were just pointing out that he was once again reading texts out of their context, and then that he should be much more careful about these thinkers that he's promoting.
Yeah, I saw you having a conversation with someone about that. To me, it's that if you're talking about that instead of the point that I made in the article, then you're distracted and you're letting yourself get distracted. At no point has, to my knowledge, has he ever denied what I said was true.
Yeah.
It's just like it's just that the consequences of what I'm saying are true. Being true is inconvenient for him, and so the problem is that I'm making his life inconvenient. It's not that I'm wrong. And I don't care. Don't recommend Bonald. I just look at me not doing it, and now I don't have this problem.
Well, and Deneen, I've been rereading Deneen lately for my research, and he, I mean, in way back in Why Liberalism Failed, that's a big issue with his methodology. Is he just bounces, he bases everything off of great books, right? He doesn't read, like, he doesn't have a deep understanding of history. He actually makes an incredible claim in there that there were these ancient societies in which they were their purpose of the society was to build people up in virtue. And it's like, what societies are you talking about? He's talking about ideals of the academy, right? He's talking about the
Yeah.
ideals of people like Plato and Xenophon and Aristotle, but those were not real societies. I mean, nobody thought they knew they weren't real societies. They were trying to make them.
Hey, Tom. You know what did Athens do to Socrates?
Yeah, Athens. Yeah, exactly. Athens killed Socrates, right?
Wait, I thought they were living a life ordered to the common good and to
Yeah,
public virtue.
yeah, no, and
Oh man,
even the best parts of Athens were only shared by what 20% of the population, and a lot of people were slaves, and it was just not a very good place to live.
I'll be honest. I do sympathize with him in one respect, which is that Aristotle's pupil Alexander was very good at preserving the polis as a way of life. Oh no, he conquered the known world
Okay.
and annihilated the polis. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It's also silly. But
I really do think, and this is something for educators, people who push the great books, is it really does. It's great. We support great books. You and I were big supporters of the great books, but it should be supplemented by history and understanding the context of these things as well.
Yeah. Yeah, the great books are where you start, but they're very high flying, and once you get to a certain point of understanding the ideas, you need to place them back on the ground to
Mm-hmm.
see what they were for. And this is why when we argue, people often say, well, was I think we had a few people say, well, what was Benoit wrong about liberalism? And I was like, I don't think the Jews took over France. So yeah. And they're like, no, what about its criticism? And it's like, yeah,
Yeah.
that was the
And also,
criticism.
Bernald was pretty bad with the history too. He had a very romantic view of how things were before industrialization.
It's a repeated framework. We're actually going to see it repeatedly in the cases where we're going to talk. We'll do Brazil in a second here. We're just kind of doing our thing at the beginning. But there's this tendency to reimagine the past as pastoral.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Bonal did that. Cortez did that.
Yeah.
Uh, and you get that with Billet. All three of the guys that Deneen recommended, before Billet sort of like imagines irreligion or skepticism. What's the term he uses? I wrote the darn article and I can't remember
Mm-hmm.
the term. I'm really not with it today. But some form of liberalism as a form of skepticism doesn't begin until the early 1700s. It's like, what are you talking about? But of course, the reason why he would say this, and if you're doing a great books approach, you don't know what the historical claim there is that he's describing the founding of the Masonic Lodge. And so if you just see that, you think, oh, this must just mean the capital E Enlightenment,
Mm-hmm.
which for Billet is Masonry. So it doesn't make sense to separate those two ideas. But Bonal thinks France was great back when the aristocracy ran things. Of course,
Mm-hmm.
the 17th century was just wonderful for France, just glorious times. Everyone was
Yeah.
happy.
And then even with those later thinkers in the 19th century, a lot of what happened was people who were living in urban settings or people who were in the aristocracy were completely detached from the lived reality of most people.
Right.
Before. So when poor people from like the poor rural people came to the cities, it was a shock to them, and they saw this great amount of poverty. But what they don't know, which gets uncovered by deeper historical, studies later, is that life for most of those people living in rural areas was terrible. There's a high amount of extreme poverty. If you look in history books when they talk about famines and stuff like that, that we still have famines in the third world now, but we don't have famines in the developed world. Yeah, that was a reality. Life was
Tom,
tough.
these were good Christian famines.
Yeah, and
These were the
also
kind of
we also don't
famines.
know how religious people were. We know they called themselves Catholic, but we don't know what the religiosity was for most people in a lot of these places either.
Yeah, this is the trouble you get into when you do the kind of work that I have over here next to me. Andrew Willard Jones' book, Before Church and State, is incredibly elite perspective that takes advantage I mean, that doesn't take seriously any kind of skepticism you would have about the intentions of the people describing things the way they are.
Mhm.
And so there are some pretty serious limitations. And one of the problems you run into often with people that do what's called social history is that they're incredibly left wing.
Mm.
And so they discredit themselves in the eyes of people who are like from the center to the right, because they see themselves as, one quarter scholar, three-quarter activists. But
Yeah.
the original meaning behind doing social history was to recover the stuff you're describing, which is that
Mhm.
it's one thing to do like before church and state kind of history, which is very elite and naive in its
Mhm.
approach to elite documentation and description, um, and instead get down to the everyday life. So when that social history is done well, it's a very important corrective.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry. We should get to move
We
on
should get
to
to
talk about
Brazil.
Brazil and their fascists and integralists, and the blurred line between those two ideas.
Well, in this case, the line will not be blurred. It will be entirely merged. There will
Okay.
um and so when we talk about Brazilian integralism, we're talking about a very special kind of integralism. And that is because it uses the sigma. And for those of you who are Gen Alpha, this is how a Zennial, I'm born in 1980, and Tom, you're a millennial, right? What are you? A
I was
millennial?
born in 1985, so
Yeah.
I'm an elder millennial.
Yeah, so we're gonna be very cool with Gen Alpha today, because today I'm gonna the name of this podcast will be What the Sigma, which is like a Gen Alpha thing they say that doesn't really mean anything. It's just extremely weird and goofy. But this idea of the sigma emerges out of Brazilian integralism, because it is partly a mathematical symbol for an integral, which is a very dorky way to get your symbol. But Plinio Salgado, who will be the person who will be the star of this story, was very dorky himself. So before we get to him, though, um, we'll have to talk about the sort of like the history prior to this, the formation of Brazilian integralist action, which fortunately is not as long as the Portuguese history was, which was extremely complicated, and took me a very long time to parse. And God knows how much of that's going to be cut and editing. And I hate the idea of it being cut because it took me 2 weeks. Uh, but anyway, Brazil is a colony of Portugal for a very long time, and it remains one until the early 19th century. As with all of these figures, the critical moment when so much of what they had held together falls apart is the French Revolution. And in the case of the French Revolution, what happens is the Portuguese king, John VI of Portugal, gets into trouble because Spain flips to Napoleon, and he gets on a boat and gets the hell out of Portugal. Not Spain. Sorry, John VI. He gets out of Portugal and goes to Brazil. And the people in Brazil, specifically Rio de Janeiro, are excited because they hope that what this will mean is that John VI will actually create that will recenter the Portuguese Empire in Brazil. They don't consider themselves sort of separate from Portugal in that sense, especially in places like the capital, where there's a lot more contact with Portuguese culture. Um, but 12 years, he leaves in 1808, 10 years after he leaves, for Brazil, things from Napoleon have died down. John VI goes back to Portugal to reclaim his throne. Now the thing is that he has a very hard time doing this. People in Portugal have not missed him, and it's very difficult for him to secure the throne. And he's handed a constitution that is going to now curtail the amount of control that he had prior to leaving. So this upsets his wife, Maria the First, and she's extremely unhappy with his decision to do this. And so she actually gets her son, Infante Manuel, to try to revolt against the Constitution, and does so by saying that it was a Masonic plot to kill the king, and this does not work. And so John VI is left having to clean up his wife's mess, and exiled his own son. Now John the Sixth heir was not Infante Manuel. It was a guy named Pedro the First, and Pedro the First, while John the Sixth is securing his throne in Portugal, is actually left in charge of Brazil back in 1818, and Pedro the First is nominally subject to John the Sixth, and he decides, no, why would I do that? So he just leaves. He just says, I'm not going to be part of the Portuguese Empire anymore. And the result for this was that the two split, but Portugal becomes much poorer, and as a result of losing this kind of colonial control. And so John the Sixth, rather than trying to get Portugal back from his heir, just lets him go. He can't really do anything about it because he's so constrained in Portugal. But when John the Sixth dies in 1826, Pedro the First comes back to Portugal, and then he gets the throne and leaves it for his son Pedro the Second. And Pedro the Second lives for like as emperor of Brazil, as a separate entity that is very closely financially and commercially tied to Portugal, for like 60 years. It's just an unbelievably long time, almost 60 years. Now, there's a problem with the long reign of a monarch, which is that people become so accustomed to the monarch, who is very capable. Pedro II was a very capable monarch, that people forget how to govern without him. And Pedro II was very worried about this. And what he had hoped was that his reign could serve as a kind of transition for Brazil from monarchy to some other form of government, preferably some kind of like constitutional republic. And so he actually, towards the end of his life, he knows he's reaching the end of his life. He ends slavery in Brazil. Slavery ends very late, like 1888. He ends slavery, which is just remarkable. The United States was very late compared to other countries, but Brazil was even later. And then he abolishes before he tries to abolish the monarchy. And what happens is that as he's trying to abolish the monarchy near the end of his life, what of course happens, Tom? What happens whenever there is going to be integralism on the horizon? There was a coup. So we have a coup, and that gets us that like disquisition right there got us from 1808 to 1888. Whereas when I had to do the Portugal one, I had to start way back. But we're basically where integralism begins to become part of the scene. We got a little bit more ground to cover, which is that there's this transition government. It's called the First Brazilian Republic. Now, my question to you, Tom, is how Republican do you think this republic was?
Gosh, I don't know Brazilian history that well.
On a 0 to 10 basis, 0 being run by a junta, and 10 being the founder's vision for this country.
Maybe 1.
It's a 1. It's a 1. It's not good. So the coup creates a Republican government, but very, very, very corrupt. And a big reason for this has a lot to do with the same problems that Portugal had, namely that a lot of the population here are recently emancipated slaves. And so for this reason, even the people who had been free, a lot of them can't read. And none of them have experience with self-government. They've lived primarily in the care of very large landholders, or they've more recently lived in cities with struggling, burgeoning industries. And they have had a monarchical and patron relations rather than ones of self-government in which people, are responsible for their own land and hold town meetings and serve on juries. This is all very foreign to them. And so the transition to Republican government in Brazil is very hard. And so what they get instead is they get something called milk coffee politics, which sounds great.
Hmm.
But it's not. It just refers to the two industries that dominated the government: coffee in Sao Paulo and milk in Minas Gerais. And what they did is effectively take turns running the government. And they had a decentralized way of doing rule outside of the two capital states called coronelism, which is rule by the colonels. So you would essentially have a local caudillo who was the patronage figure for the state, in which people would come to him for help as a kind of godfather like figure. And they would fix what they could with their contacts in the so called republic. Um, Now, despite this being the arrangement being, pretty corrupt, primarily in service to landed interests, and it was stable. So when we look at things like Portugal, where they're having their kings assassinated and stuff like that, and when we do Argentina, which is spends the entire 19th century on fire, with the British going in there and taking their beef exports. But Brazil is stable, but it could be so much better. And it had been better under Pedro II, but he's dead, and it's not coming back.
Mhm.
So this lasts from 1889 until 1930. And it's at that point when the system of patronage and turn taking breaks down, because Sao Paulo doesn't want to take turns anymore. It's becoming a little bit more important than Minas Gerais. And so it's at this point a Sao Paulan runs for office when it's not his turn, and a person who says he's going to clean up the government, a man named Getulio Vargas, runs, and the Brazilian army stages a coup to place him in the presidency, which Vargas treats functionally as a dictatorship.
Hmm.
So uh, I'll stop there for a second because we've now gotten to where the integralists surface, but that was a long time talking. So is that and is there anything that needs explanation?
No, no, that's really helpful background to understand like what the situation was like in Brazil. I wonder what the gosh, Brazil is such a huge country. Um, you said it rotated back and forth between the two major cities as far as the rule of the whole country.
Yeah, the real money making areas, because so much of it is cash crop exports. That was its original function as a colonial possession of Portugal, and that economic pattern, what in
Hmm.
political science is called path dependency, kind of borrows from economics a little bit there, where once you go down a certain economic model, you tend to stick with it. It's very hard to break out of it until the incentives make it impossible to stay there.
Hmm. Now, was you said that when they started the republic, they were very poor and illiterate. Did things get a little bit better by 1930?
Yeah, that's actually exactly right. What happens by 1930 is that the stability that they've overseen, it's not exactly, great.
Hmm.
We would not like to live under this government, but it is sufficient so that the Brazilians living there increasingly begin to live under better standards of living. But they're also, like so many other people during this period, they're also urbanizing. And of course, 1930 is not a coincidence when there's a coup, because this is when you have a global financial crisis prompted by the Great Depression in the United States. There's just this sort of general collapse in economic well-being, and so this sort of steady improvement in quality of life for the median Brazilian suddenly vanishes, and many of them remember what it was like before, and they feel as though they're returning to it. And so while they, were willing to tolerate the corruption when it meant an improving standard of living, they get corruption and a declining standard of living, now they're willing to go with Vargas as a dictator.
Hmm. Okay.
So this is when we get to good old Plinio. Plinio Salgado was the son of a Sao Paulo colonel. So he was, essentially the son of one of these caudillos, or one of these godfathers that lived in one of the most important regions, Sao Paulo, in Brazil for the politics of the time. And he was what I would describe as kind of a nerd. And if you see pictures of him, he's slight. He has this little mustache.
Hmm.
He's very bookish. He writes books, but he's not terribly intellectually gifted. He's sort of average,
Hmm.
but he's very earnest. So he also loves his first wife very much, a woman named Maria Amalia, who he loses while she's giving birth, and becomes very depressed over this, and sort of goes back to his Catholic roots and reads the work of Brazilian and Portuguese Catholic theologians. And one of them is Jackson de Figueiredo, who was a Catholic convert, a very anti-liberal, and then a kind of spiritualist named Raimundo de Farias Brito,
Hmm.
um, who was never Catholic but was equally very anti-liberal. And this is a period for Salgado that's very important in the 1920s, because he's really essentially laying the foundation on which he'll rest the rest of his political career. And what's incredible about the timing of Salgado doing this is that he leaves. He's a very wealthy banker from Sao Paulo who knows Salgado through probably family connections. Um, Decides that he's going to send this sort of newly politically ambitious Salgado to fascist Italy,
Hmm.
to see like what could be done to repair the corruption by installing an authoritarian sort of bureaucracy that could rationalize Brazilian life, especially as it's shifting from agricultural cash crops to a more mixed economy.
Hmm.
The solution was supposed to be El Duce.
Hmm.
So Salgado goes and meets personally with Mussolini
Hmm.
in the summer and the early autumn of this. He meets with Mussolini, meets with many high-ranking Italian officials, because Mussolini at this point, 1930, right? He's very firmly ensconced in political authority of Italy, and he's looking for allies and he's looking for opportunities. And if they're on the cusp of a coup, like sort of the kind that he pulled off, then this is a good sort of like ideological alliance. Or and so Mussolini really, takes an interest in Salgado. Um, Says to him he actually personally tells him to develop an initial set of ideas to guide society in alignment with a new conscience, to later act as a basis for a political party. And recommends that Salgado promote this as a kind of self-proclaimed genius. Um, and so Salgado's response to meeting Mussolini is that he has an admiration for Italy, a place where the streets exuded enthusiasm, which he believed had some similarities to Brazil, a country of people who know how to place the nation's interests above those of classes.
Hmm.
And so he comes home to Sao Paulo on October 4th, the day before Vargas's coup. Now, you could put your tinfoil hat on and say that this was planned. It was not planned,
Hmm.
because Vargas and Salgado have nothing to do with each other, and this is going to be very important. Um, Salgado comes back armed with this desire to essentially baptize um, fascism. He
Hmm.
likes the methodology, but he does not like the implicit and in some places explicit atheism or agnosticism. So he wants to
Hmm.
make it Catholic. So at this point, Brazilian integralism is effectively Catholic fascism.
Okay.
That's why when you said like there's some blurred lines, it's like no. Salgado goes to the guy who starts fascism,
Hmm.
loves it,
Mhm.
It says we're doing it back in Brazil. And then of course, for a very long time, as long as Salgado is like making moves in Brazil, Mussolini is sending him money.
Okay.
So I don't know. I mean, like, to me, that seems like he's just a fascist, except it's
Yeah.
Catholic, but in a weird sort of Brazilian fashion of Catholicism.
Hmm. So, so then what goes down? What happens then with this? So would you say then this sort of integralist fascism, then it's in power in Brazil? What happens? What kind of things that are specifically integralists go down?
At first, what's funny is that Salgado's actually not a fan of Vargas.
Hmm.
Because remember, Vargas is interrupting the control of Sao Paulo, and that's where he's from. Not
Hmm.
Vargas, I'm sorry, but Salgado. So that's he supported the Sao Paulan candidate whose name I didn't include in the chapter, and so I don't remember because I was trying to find things that I didn't have to include as details. It gets pretty complicated when writing this stuff.
Hmm.
So if you're a reader and you've got this guy who's mentioned once and is a candidate who loses, it sort of feels useless. But in a podcast, I feel irresponsible not remember his name. It's like Presti or something like that. Anyway, so Vargas knows this too, right? Vargas is no fool. But Salgado forms over the course of several months a kind of meeting house for all of the right wing parties in Brazil to compare notes. And
Hmm.
so he does precisely what Mussolini tells him to do. Right.
Hmm.
He tries to form a new political movement in which he's the self proclaimed genius. So he starts beginning the political movement. In the process of doing so, by May 6, 1932, this after the third of these meetings, they announced that all these parties have merged into a party called Brazilian Integralist Action, and they issue something called the October Manifesto, which is in English on the Internet Archive. You can go look at it. And
Hmm.
it opens very integralist. It talks about God as the guarantor of the common good and the state having a hierarchy that emulates his. And then it gets more and more politically sort of parochial to Brazilian politics of the time.
Hmm.
But it's the same classic sort of post-liberal frame, right? God, family, fatherland of
Yeah, yeah.
you know
Universal.
and so there's this whole description of the family, and of course the role of the state is to guarantee the support of the family. um
Okay.
yeah, classic, like it's what's in Vichy, it's what's in Franco, it's what's in the Estado Novo in Portugal. We've seen it all a bunch of times. But again, I've mentioned the curious nature of Brazilian culture, which is that the Brazilian integralists of all the people we'll look at are the least Catholic. There's a lot of spiritualism, and there's a lot of animism in Brazil because of the very large population of native peoples, as well as not terribly well integrated formerly enslaved peoples, many of whom are speaking Creoles of African languages and Portuguese. And so, what's funny about the integralists is that they're affirmatively Catholic, but they're also very internally pluralistic in a way that sort of defies a lot of the way that many post liberals and at the time contemporary integralists would have not been comfortable with.
Hmm.
Um, they have also an example of this, and I don't quite know how to say this, but it's like Anue,
Yeah.
which is not a Portuguese word. It's a Tupi word. That's a people from a native people of Brazil, which means "you are my family" or "you're my brother." And they would say "anwe" to each other, and then they would do like a little Roman salute. And if it was to Salgado, they would say it 3 times.
Hmm.
Um, and so Brazilian integralism is also really complete. Whereas when you look at integralism as a movement in are you getting it? Yeah, here we go. Here's the manifesto. Yeah, God leads the destinies of peoples. And so this This Manifesto of October is distributed widely and is actually very popular. It's translated into a lot of different languages, and you'll find people organizing around Brazilian integralism in places as wide as Philadelphia, Geneva, Zurich, Porto, and Lisbon, Berlin, and Rome, and New Orleans. So it's all over the place. And when you look at what's in the complete nature of this integralism is that they don't just do an integralism of politics, they have an integralism of everything. So they have a uniform. So if you're an integralist, you wear a green shirt and you have a white armband with the sigma representing the integration or the integral in your on your armband. So the original sigma males were a bunch of studious Catholic nerds in Brazil who loved fascism and the color green. But it's not just that you had a uniform for men. Women had it too. Women were supposed to wear green blouses with the same armband, I think. Men had to wear very plain pants. Women had to wear white or black skirts. If you were going to have a marriage, it had to be done according to a kind of integralist style in which the people attending would wear their uniforms. If you were going to have a baptism, and it would have to accord with the terms of and style outlined by an integralist manual. If you were going to go drink or engage in carousing of some variety and you were caught in uniform, you would be disciplined. And so this kind of became like a club or even like cultish in the way that they would deploy these sorts of things. They were integralist candies. Yeah, there it is. We found the social question section. Uh,
It looks like they don't mention Jews though, so
no,
that's
no.
a positive development.
Yeah, so Plinio Salgado is not an anti-Semite.
That's good.
Yeah, his colleague Gustavo Barroso is, and he doesn't have anything to do with the manifesto. So when we get to Barroso, uh, that's when that stuff starts to show up.
Hey,
But
does
this
this
is
remind you a little bit of regime change here when Janine's talking about the integration of all parts of society at the end of the book?
what we need in Brazil, according to Plinio Sagada, are better elites.
Better elites, huh?
I don't know if anyone has read this manifesto but me and now you and the people reading this, watching this podcast on YouTube. But I strongly doubt Deneen has. But it's just weird how people, when going down a post-liberal line, end up in the same place every time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and
Oh,
that's
there it is.
because
And these are the
that's because
paths of our march.
yeah. Uh, so very goofy manifesto in retrospect, but at the time taken very seriously because it has a massive cultural imprint. And Vargas now has this rival on his hands with Plinio Salgado, right? It's very unclear to him what to do. And so, really, what he does is nothing. He just kind of lets this go. So, there are two other people that are a big part of integralism. One is during this period. One of them is, let's see if I can find his name because I didn't include him, and he's a bit more important than Miguel Real, who's he's more of the economist and legal side. But Gustavo Barroso here, you can this great book by Leandro Gonzalez and Odilon Neto. Barroso's at the top and Real's at the bottom. Um, Barroso's the crazy man. And so he, to help the integralist effort, translates the protocols of the elders of Zion from the French translation into Portuguese. Nice, and writes his own book called Masonaria, Judaísmo, and Comunismo, um, which is meant to sort of compare to the International Jew by Henry Ford. It's sort of
Hmm.
cribbed from his work. And so Barroso is sort of the bad cop to
Mhm.
Salgado's good cop, and Real is more of the bagman or the operator. And
Okay.
Barroso and Salgado get into it often. And at one point, Barroso tried to kind of corner Salgado from having any kind of political influence, and Salgado pulled the ultimate trump card, which is he said, "Okay, fine, I resign." And then no, 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 and everyone protests. They don't want that to happen. And then Barroso got played. Right now, everyone feels bad for Salgado, and so Barroso has to play second fiddle and plagiarize anti-Semitism. Um,
Mhm.
uh, so uh, so that's why the manifesto actually looks pretty clean. Is that Barroso didn't have anything to do with it, and then you get to some of the other stuff that the integralists do, and that's where it comes in. It comes in from a different figure. So let's see. Um, by 1934, Brazilian integralists were in open conflict with Brazilian factions. And this is because of a several year fight over something called the Constitutionalist Revolt, in which left wing Brazilians wanted Vargas to issue a new constitution since the First Republic was over. And he finally relents on some of their issues. And what Salgado kept saying is that Vargas didn't have to hold up that constitution or do any of the concessions that he made to, that he rules by right of God. Um, and so they increasingly come into conflict because one of the other things I did not mention that the integralists do as part of their kind of complete, almost cult-like formation is they have a militia. And this is
Mhm.
another thing that Salgado like rips off directly from Mussolini, which is you have to have a fascisti, right? You have to have a paramilitary wing of your party. And so he has a militia in which all 16 to 42-year-old male members belonged and would, be in different sort of divisions that did things from, arms to organization to communications, all the things that you would normally have as a regular infantry, they would do. So in 1934, after the Constitutionalist Revolt is over and things aren't going as planned according to the resolution of things made in during the period of the revolt, there's increasing amount of conflict. So a left-wing labor union took to the streets while a large number of Brazilian integralists were marching for an event. This is in 32. This is a little before 1834. And some of the left-wing union guys go after the Brazilian and integralist flag to kind of mess with them. And in the process, there's a very, very tenacious fight because so many of these guys are like offended. So many of the integralists are offended at this. And so one of the guys who's an integralist, Nicola Rosica, is defending the flag, gets shot by one of the union guys, dies.
Hmm.
Um, and instantly he becomes a martyr. And this opens up a tremendous amount of sympathy among unaligned Brazilians for this for the integralists. And so Rosica is sort of touted as this person who was willing to give the final measure of devotion, but rather than for the union, it's for some like goofy Sigma male thing.
Mhm.
Um, but at this point, it's got real legs, this movement. And what happens is that in the process of Vargas taking this deal in 34, after all of these street fights during this period that continue with the integralists on the streets fighting for Vargas, is that Salgado actually runs against Vargas for president, but informally, like people write him in. Salgado
Mhm.
does not actually campaign.
Mhm.
So Vargas wins. A lot of integralists vote for Salgado, I think, in part because they're so devoted to integralism,
Mhm.
but they're happy with Vargas. And Vargas, after winning re-election, tosses all of his concessions in the trash
Hmm.
and says we're not doing this constitutionalism bit. And says that the whole thing was the result of something called the Cohen Plan, which is this Jewish attempt on the Brazilian government. And Vargas had made a lot of promises to Salgado about Integralists essentially getting to run the Ministry of Education
Hmm.
after the election of 1936. I should have mentioned the year of the election. It's 2 years after the end of the Constitutionalist revolt.
Hmm.
And so he gets in there and says, "No, we're not doing the Constitution because that was Jewish." And integralists go to hell. I'm not doing it. Yeah. He's like, I'm not giving you anything in the Ministry of Education. Get out of here.
So it sounds like Trump with Project 2025, or
You said it, not me. Like I've said, I am in Project 2025. So
you are in
yeah.
Project 2025?
Yeah, I have a profile. If you go there, if you're in it, you can see me. My picture's in there. If the Trump campaign somehow, pulls a rabbit out of a hat and wins, I'm definitely under consideration if they change their mind on Project 2025 for higher education policy.
Oh,
So
really?
I'll kiss this podcast goodbye, man. I'll be big time.
Oh
I
boy.
don't need this office. None of this. All right. I'll be in the White House. No, okay. I'm done. Anyway, so Vargas stabbed Salgado in the back. All right. These guys have been taking bullets for Vargas, and remember, he he doesn't want their help. Or
Uh-huh.
he didn't get into office with them. They're out in the streets taking bullets for him, and
So
he
it kind
didn't
of
ask
sounds
them to
like
do
the
that.
post-liberals with Trump.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Although the post-liberals don't have a paramilitary wing that we know about.
Yeah. And at least Vermeulen got on that administrative law advisory committee. He at least got
Sure.
like the this tiny little crumb. Him and a guy named Kloster or something like that as his assistant on there. These two integralists, like they got on there. But what Salgado got was a middle finger. Like, get out of here! You guys are nuts. so
Wow. Was that
so
the end of it then?
no, no,
Okay.
no, 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 no. If you look at the cover of this book, you'll see what happens to them eventually, which is that they become a bunch of terrorists. But
Holy cow.
but Salgado is not doing that yet. And so what happens is that Salgado leaves Brazil. It becomes very clear that he is not going to get what he wants. He said, let's see here, from this really great book on page 44, the integralist leader, that's Salgado, was sure he would settle an agreement with Getulio Vargas, making his arrest and exile temporary. Yeah, that's right. He'd been arrested. Excuse me. Forgot to mention that. He also had plans to self-exile in Argentina because it was closer to Brazil. It would be easier to establish connections and potential political agreements in Argentina. However, these plans fell through. Plinio's exile was to Portugal, and it was the result of a negotiation between the Vargas government in Brazil and, hey, look who's back, Salazar.
Salazar. Okay.
Yeah, Salazar was like, I'll take him.
Hmm.
It's fine. Now that was that Vargas accepted that arrangement. So what is Salgado up to in Portugal during the 1930s?
I do not
Uh,
know.
I want you to imagine the worst possible thing he could be doing.
Uh, Collaborating with the Nazis?
Uh, yes.
Really? No way.
No, I hope you enjoyed my dramatic pause.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. Page 47. We have this great, again, this is Fascism in Brazil from Integralism to Bolsonarism by Leandro Gonzalez and Odilon Neto. So I'm going to read here a little bit. His absence halted the Integralist movement. Plinio Salgado was in no position to point any direction for the group. His actions became more discreet. He tried in every way to bargain with the Brazilian government. He said he would accept an agreement, but Vargas had no interest in welcoming Plinio Salgado in Brazil. As a result, he focused his efforts elsewhere, the Nazis. The relationship between integralists and Nazis was not new. When the Brazilian integralist action was legal, there was some proximity between the two groups based on their many connections and similarities. With the advance of Nazism, and from 1933 onward, Adolf Hitler sought to expand his territorial and political reach, culminating with World War II in 1939. Got it. Portugal was a target of this expansion project mainly because of the large number of Germans residing in that country. Um, this was enough to get Plinio Salgado's attention because extreme discretion was mandatory since making connections with Nazism would mean siding against Brazil. Brazil was not aligned. He delegated this to his private secretary, Hermes Lins de Albuquerque. Um, so at the end of 1941, two German journalists known as Braggart and Baron introduced Erich Schroeder to Plinio Salgado and his secretary. There was great interest in establishing a connection with Hitler. In a conversation with his confidant and friend Ribeiro Couto, Plinio stated that this was the beginning of universal salvation. He believed Nazism had the potential to seize power in Brazil. After a series of secret unions between Erich Schroeder and Plinio Salgado, they scheduled a meeting in Portugal with the representative of the SS, a paramilitary organization linked to the Nazi Party, and Adolf Hitler. During a work trip to Berlin, Schroeder talked about this with the SS officer Walter Schellenberg, who had met Salgado in the spring of 1942. Amidst wine and beer, they had a secret meeting about the potential collaboration between integralist leaders and the Nazis. Plinio suggested that the integralists and Nazis could strongly support one another after Germany won the war. The intent was clear. They sought to recognize Salgado as the great political force in Brazil associated with victory of the Axis, since Vargas started siding with the Allies after some agreements with the United States.
Wow. You just said, imagine what the worst thing that happened would be, and I had no idea.
So when people talk about these things like integralism and post-liberalism, the extent to which this kind of collaboration doesn't happen is based entirely on the virtue of the person advocating for them.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so Dolphus, is a good man. He's a flawed man, but he's also hemmed in. We'll do a Dolphus episode. Salazar was a very sane, almost clinically rational person. So he
Yeah.
knew better than to get involved.
Mm-hmm.
Salgado, sad. He's kind of a nerd.
Mm-hmm.
He thinks he should be in charge, not Vargas.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so God knows how much of that Barroso propaganda got to him, but I mean, you can see why there's a common bond there. The Nazis had these crazy conspiracy theories that were linked to eugenic theories about Jews and the Roma, and of course they were anti-Masonic and this kind of conspiratorial mindset. So yeah, I was not kidding, man. Like it is bananas what he was doing. And I don't say that just because, Brazil grows bananas.
Now, did he agree with the conspiratorial stuff, or was he just it was just sort of an opportunistic?
So he doesn't seem to ever really he doesn't really care about that stuff. I don't think he
Mm-hmm.
ever really endorses it. I don't think he condemns it.
Mm-hmm.
What he wants is to be in charge of Brazil, and he will gladly hoist a Luger and a Roman salute to Der Fuhrer,
Mm-hmm.
if that's what it means, especially because Vargas has been so mean.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens, unfortunately, from his perspective, fortunately for our perspective and the perspective of all good and normal people, is that he gets found out and he sells out everyone. He gets
Oh.
found out, yeah, and because that, like, as soon as he's found out, he's persona non grata in Brazil and Portugal. So he essentially has to like say it wasn't me, even though it was totally him.
Hmm.
And does this primarily just to save his bacon, and it's bad, man.
Okay. So how did he get found out that he was collaborating with the Nazis?
Um, so they don't say. Um, what we do get is that Hitler promised to provide full support for the integralist movement after German victory. Um, and Yeah, eventually, like, the people in Salazar's government get sick of the Nazis kind of moving around inside Portugal, and they're condemned. And I think there must have been a leak from either the Nazis or from the integralists. I'm sorry, I'm looking through here. Um, but once it became public, Salgado immediately shut down the project, denied any action in favor of the Axis, since the position would make him the enemy of both Brazil and Portugal. Again, Portugal was not aligned.
Hmm.
With no agreement between Vargas and Hitler, Salgado tried to establish a safe and indisputable discourse for the reconstruction of integralism, Christianity, and the use of God to justify political practices.
Hmm.
So Brazilian integralism becomes what we normally associate with integralism now.
Hmm.
And he writes this sort of below average book on Jesus, and starts to do a lot of Catholic theology, or sort of faux Catholic theology. And he eventually gets back after the war's over. He's taken back to Brazil, and he
Hmm.
starts a political movement, but it's not the integralists. It's instead called the People Representation Party, or the PRP,
Hmm.
and it uses the silver bell as its image, and it's a flop. I mean, he does okay. He gets into office a few times, but you know what? It's the PRP's big ideology is, right?
Hmm.
It's Christian democracy, Tom.
Oh, okay. Okay. So
This guy's everything.
we're seeing like different camps of post-liberalism here, like we see now even.
Yeah, it's and he's being very, he just wants to be important. He just wants to be in power. So he does the Christian democracy thing. It does not go well. He tries. Um all the people who are supporting him in all of these efforts are just integralists. So eventually he just
So it's
decides
kind
to
of like Soraba Murray when he does the social democracy thing.
correct.
Okay.
He changed his language, but he ultimately didn't change his stripes. Here he is in 1957, after the Silver Bell PRP movement ends. What's he back in? That's right, he's back in the green with the Sigma. You know,
Okay. Brings back
this
the
picture.
Sigma.
In this picture, yeah, like, it was all a fraud. Everyone knew what he was doing. He tries to bring integralism back towards the
It's
end of his
maybe he
life.
tried to pick up the armbands that later period.
That's right. That's
Hmm.
right. And as integralism begins to have sort of like important, like, silver anniversaries, they start to march again. And so the PRP and the integralists are kind of the same thing, but they're legally or ideologically separate, and
Hmm.
it's all very goofy. But he eventually passes on. Um, and The way that he was able to kind of uh, try to make a position that was more publicly defensible is that he opposed communism, and he opposed what's here described as eroticism. Very, I'm very sort of morality clauses in Brazilian government. So he becomes a social conservative and anti-communist, but
Hmm.
deep down in his guts, what he is an anti-liberal who wants a executive administrative dictatorship
Hmm.
where he's in charge.
Hmm.
And he's willing to go silver bell Christian democracy to get there. He's willing to go green shirt armband to get there. He'll
Hmm.
do anything he can. He dies a failure.
Hmm. When did he die?
Integralism persists. He died. When did he die? He lived a very long time. It's kind of amazing. December was in 1975.
Mm.
Yeah.
So around time of Francisco Franco dying.
Right. Some of these guys live a long time. But by then, Salgado is very much a spent force, and integralism changes into a right-wing paramilitary organization. Very bad stuff.
And that's why they're
Uh,
all dressed and covering their face because they want to be identified.
yeah, and I read the whole book when it first came out. I think it was like 1 or 2 years ago. But I have not read that part yet. It was 2 years ago. I haven't read that part again. I was just reading the Salgado stuff, so I don't remember very much of it.
Are there still
Um,
paramilitary integralists in Brazil now?
See,
Because they might
that's
be
the
useful to these posts. No, just kidding.
uh yeah. So they attacked Porta de Fundos on let's see here, 2019. I think
Wow, that's
on the night of December 24th, Christmas Eve, while most families were gathering in search of some dialogue after the preceding troubled election months, the headquarters of Porta de Fundos in Humanitá, a neighborhood south of Rio de Janeiro, were attacked. Molotov cocktails were thrown into the building. Thanks to a security guard who was there at the time, the tragedy did not gain more significant proportions. He narrowly dodged the flames and glass shards. A few hours after the attack, a video was shared on social media. The video depicted three people wearing hoods over their heads and green shirts with the Sigma. An integralist flag could be seen spread out in the background. On the table was a Brazilian imperial flag, not their Ordo and Progressa flag.
I'm guessing these people aren't very religious anymore.
What they said here is Porta dos Fundos made a direct attack against the faith of the Brazilian people, hiding behind the veil of freedom of speech. These damned servants of big capital profaned the Holy Spirit by calling our Lord Jesus Christ a bastard and Mary a prostitute and adulteress.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, I was making too light of this very serious thing, and I'm confident all the post liberals that we know of would oppose this. So
Yeah. But why? They
yeah,
would, but why? Is it because
yeah,
of
it would be one of those
liberal
cases
ideas?
where it would the serious issue would be they'll start something and then they find themselves surrounded by people like this, and then it's already too late to stop it.
Yeah. It's, they know what the proper limits are.
Hmm.
They don't often mention them because there's a lot of energy and advocating for this sort of thing and getting people hyped up. But when you get true believers on your hands, they do this.
Hmm.
Okay. And so it's one thing to get an all paid flight to Hungary to hang out with Viktor Orban and eat some borscht, maybe made by a Russian spy. I don't know.
Yeah,
But and you get to give a speech and everyone pretends to understand you and claps and thinks you're super smart, and then you go home with a big a big ego boost. But this stuff happens too.
yeah,
And this is not the result of academics getting the red carpet. This is the result of people taking seriously things that you've said. And I mean, I wrote for Law and Liberty several years ago a paper on this. I can't remember if it was After Republican Virtue or Integralism as an Ideology of Despair. I think it was uh that one, and Integralism as Ideology of Despair, where there were guys that were saying this stuff
hmm,
in a Thomism group of all things.
yeah.
Maybe it was the other one. Maybe it was After Republican Virtue. Let me just call that up. Um, so what's funny is that as we're talking about this essay that I wrote, the bannerhead on Law and Liberty is of Plinio Salgado. I forgot. I
Oh,
called it up, and you could see I could see Real and Barroso up there. Barroso's sitting to his right, or standing to his
oh, and
right,
that
looking.
wasn't intentional.
No, I just forgot.
Funny.
um. Yeah, so I was, or maybe I've been kicked out, or maybe I left. It was this Facebook group that was all based around the study of Thomism, but the rise of integralism around 2015 and 16 turned it into a bit of a hotbed. And there was a guy in that group who was defending um, all kinds of insane things. Let me see. He said the communion of saints really do all wear jackboots and the Sigma armbands. They burned heretics and they seized Jewish kids. That's Catholicism. And then another one was no one of goodwill should take these racism type charge seriously. Here, meaning some of us are pointing out the anti-Semitism. It is a charge living an utterly different moral world, a world which should not get a scrap of acknowledgement. If it isn't obvious how misguided and self-defeated that is, at least experience should have taught us, seeing past the liberal moral frame and asserting the old one, and accepting the friend-enemy distinction as applied to the church is the biggest challenge facing Josiah's-type integralists today.
It's really backwards because they're so opposed to liberalism that they want to oppose then all the Christian things that liberalism also contains. Because
yeah.
So and then adopt something that's really more pagan, like this friend enemy distinction stuff.
Right.
It's very tribal.
Yeah.
That's really messed up. There's nothing Christian about Carl Schmitt. That's just really absurd. But you see this throughout, I guess, from the Middle Ages. The church's teaching on just war is one thing, right? But
right.
Then there's the mob mentality of the religious mob, and those two things are very much opposed to one another. Because I think as I understand it, secular wars in the Middle Ages were a little bit more civil than the religious wars, in the sense that they were a little bit more humane. They wouldn't go after citizens or whatever, just ordinary citizens, peasants, and stuff like that, right? But in religious wars, because it's about heresy and apostasy, even if in principle they would be opposed to going after them, the mob mentality kind of took over, and they were some of the nastiest wars in the Middle Ages. And
yeah,
I'm saying that as a believing Catholic, I'm saying, like, you got to be careful with this zealotry.
The Cathar crusade was really brutal. I got in trouble on Twitter because I read an article from Time magazine to get the number of people who died, and it said over 1 million.
Yeah.
And then people got like really upset with me because they thought that number was too high. And it turns out it was actually an historian who said that, but the historian was apparently anti-Catholic, which God forbid. I apparently have to do I have to do graduate level research for me to say how many people died.
How much was it? Was it? It was over 200.
It was more like 500,000. So it's like, oh, well, just
yeah, the big numbers.
A few thousand here, a few thousand there. Next thing you know, we're talking about real casualties,
which was a lot in the Middle Ages because you didn't have territorial states that had which do a lot more damage.
And I'm not a Cathar. I don't really have. I should mention that's a Gnostic heresy. It's when we say Cathars, we're not talking about the things they put in your junk when you are in the hospital.
Yeah,
go to the bathroom.
I was always told
that's
that
the catheter heresy.
Saint Dominic went to the Cathars and tried to preach to them, and eventually he realized that if he was nicer and he would try to understand where they were coming from, then more of them were converted. So the story of Saint Dominic was that he was like, persuasion, interacting with people, relating with them was a lot more effective.
But Saint Dominic was not a pagan. That's why he thought that, right? When
that's
you
right.
want to use
then
violence,
when you get to the New World discovery, you have these guys who look like they're sober, like De las Casas, being like, guys, you can't be. Or even what's his name? The big one,
Victoria Suarez.
Victoria saying, critiquing the excesses and saying, like, hey, they have a right to rule themselves. You can't go and just rule over them and enslave them and all. And but with the groupthink of the zealotry or whatever, all these excuses, all these religious excuses come up. So that can happen in these zealot groups, that they make all these excuses for things that really are opposed to the Catholic teaching on morality.
Which is why you hold the line. It's why, like, you don't go down this post-liberal temptation, because just because you wouldn't give in to the full like neo-pagan violence doesn't mean that others won't.
So do you think that post-liberals today should be very concerned about all these alliances with China and Hungary?
I mean, obviously. And I have a friend of mine who always likes to point out that academics are always the best bang for your buck.
Hmm.
They have reach to students, they have reach to journalists, they have reach through their own publications. Uh, they have reach in their institutions and hiring, especially if they're at elite institutions like Adrian and Pat, to some degree Chad. I'm sorry, these are Adrian Vermeule, Chad Pecknold, and Patrick Deneen. And the amount that you need to give them and resources is almost zero.
Hmm.
You fly them around, you tell them how smart they are,
Hmm.
you occasionally send them some sort of message, and it's all the validation they've ever wanted for their work.
Hmm.
Um, and that's how you get fellow travelers. That's how it's very easy to cultivate academics. It's very hard to like cultivate business people because they want to know like what's in it for them,
Hmm.
and they cost a lot of money and they have competing interests. But academics, because um they don't have that same level of stakes, they're very easy to push around, especially because giving them those resources might actually make them more influential and even more zealous in their defense.
Hmm.
And often they're unaware of the other things that you're doing. So you can have them defending you while you're doing sort of more nefarious things. So
Hmm.
Adrian goes to bat, or Adrian Vermeil goes to bat for China all the time, and they'll be he'll get mad that people are talking about that a tennis player Pang, what's her name, Pang,
Yeah, yeah.
and he'll just retweet propaganda about how it's not real because they told him
Hmm.
it wasn't real, and these are the people who were nice to him and told him how smart he was about Carl Schmitt, and
Hmm.
that's all it takes. That's
Yeah.
really all it takes.
And we saw from that one article that Carl Schmitt's becoming pretty big among the
Yeah,
like Chinese intellectuals and stuff like that.
yeah. Schmittian thought and Xi Jinping are very close. I forget the name of the political philosopher who's essentially like the state ideologist, like Huan Huning, I think, maybe, I don't know.
Hmm.
Sort of operates in the same Alexander Dugin sort of role for Putin. Is a
Hmm.
big Schmittian. So
Hmm.
if you can get that level of access to Chinese government, and even if you're an HLS professor, that's going to feel good.
Hmm.
It's like, wow, I'm actually making a change here now. And also because you're making that, you feel like you're making that change, or you're having that influence, and you're not like a villain,
Hmm.
right? Like you're not, like Adrian doesn't like put people in wood chippers for disagreeing with him. He just blocks them on Twitter and says nasty things about them.
Hmm.
So he's like, I'm involved now, and I'm
Hmm.
not a monster.
Hmm.
So how could these people be monsters? The answer is, well, they're not telling you all the monster stuff they're doing.
Hmm. So, based on what we've seen from the history of the integralist movement in these integralist movements, what do you think about this tendency among Catholic scholars who are really just social conservatives to call themselves soft integralists? Do you think that's a smart idea from a rhetorical standpoint or a
What
persuasive
is
standpoint?
that? What is a soft integralist?
Yeah.
What do
So
they
I don't.
mean?
I guess they support blue laws. Uh,
Okay,
yeah, some nudges towards socially conservative ends.
that's not that's not integralism.
Yeah, I know.
Integralism is an endorsement of a particular approach to law and regime.
Hmm.
It's not. We had blue laws.
Hmm.
We had
U.S.
confessional states in the
Yeah, yeah,
United States.
yeah,
They weren't integralist.
yeah. That's right. Yeah, blue laws are not an integralist. I mean, that's a separate thing. That's something we've had throughout the history of the United States. So.
I mean, the confessional states were Protestant. Um, but what that meant, I remember I had a debate here. It was my colleague, John Coleman, whose book you can usually see in frame over this, is Everyone Orthodox to Themselves. He's an actual liberal. He like so he's more a radical
Hmm.
on these things than I am. I kind of call myself a Catholic Republican. It's a little R.
Hmm.
Um, but we were having a debate with two other of our colleagues. I won't say who they are. And um, there were two lines from that debate that always stuck with me. By the way, I was high as a kite on cold medicine because I was very sick, and I had like an antibiotic resistant uh, um, like nasal infection or whatever they call it, upper respiratory infection. So
Oh,
I'm high as a kite on these drugs, and so um, someone responded. One of the debaters we were opposing us. Oh, the question was resolved. The United States should have a confessionally Catholic state, and uh, John. So John and one of the interlocutors were arguing, and one of the interlocutors said, "Well, that's not what Aquinas said." And John Coleman says, "Well, who said Aquinas was a very good political philosopher?" And the room just goes silent, and I'm laughing. This
mhm,
congested mess of a human being. I am laughing, almost falling on the floor,
mhm.
laughing
Yeah.
because that was such. I don't mean to offend the Thomas who listened to this. I
Oh
just
no,
can't believe he said
Thomas.
it.
I should say something here. Thomas Aquinas is my favorite philosopher. I've been studying Thomas Aquinas for, gosh, 18 years now. I'm very, whatever. But I never, besides the few things he says about law and, a few things here and there, I just never thought of him as much as a political philosopher.
Yeah,
And I've talked to other people who are interested in Thomas Aquinas who say the same thing. Like they really think de Reino is kind of overrated. It's not that interesting of a word. They're just they're
it's
just
also not done.
they don't think that Aquinas spent very much of his life thinking about these things.
He
And
did not.
we also should take with a grain of salt a work like De Reino, which is a Mirror of Princes, and it's going to be a very, what do you call it? What is it when when you're writing a letter to a prince, it's not gonna be too critical of the principality itself, right?
Right.
I think we should
The
all take
other
that with a grain of salt and realize that Thomas Aquinas spent very little amount of his intellectual life thinking about these things.
the other thing that was said at the debate, I said, which is I asked one of the guys, like, how much are we going to tax Jews to pay for the building of Catholic Church and the training of seminarians? And that is what the payout is for confessional states,
Mm-hmm.
and it's why confessional states after the ratification of the Constitution went the way of the dodo.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't because the people became impious and corrupt. They already were, and that's the thing about all of the people that live in confessional states is that they're still people,
Mm-hmm.
and religiosity varies widely, and there are lots of things that affect this. The problem was that is that the people in the confessed religion were not very numerous,
Mm-hmm.
and they were receiving tax benefits for having a monopoly on publicly supported religion.
Mm-hmm.
And this just ran all kinds of people crazy. And
Yeah.
in the South, a group of people that were most driven crazy by this were Catholics in
Mm-hmm.
Maryland.
Yeah.
But in the last two confessional states were Connecticut, Rhode Island. Not, I'm sorry, it was Connecticut, Massachusetts. Excuse me. And it was the Baptists
Mm-hmm.
that ran out the establishment there. Also on De Reino, the person who does the best to make De Reino something really good
Mm-hmm.
is our friend William
Yeah.
McCormick, who is
Yeah.
a
Definitely.
Jesuit. He's not yet a priest. What do they
Yeah.
call them?
Yeah.
Scholastic.
Yeah.
It's called the Christian Structure of Politics. Really dynamite book, and it's good when Russ Hittinger endorses the back.
Yeah. No, and I understand that he contextualizes as well, saying that we should take some of the things with a grain of salt, given the genre.
Yeah, because Aquinas is notoriously inconsistent throughout his life, and his commentary on the sentences, he's in favor of tyrannicide, and the Summa, it's kind of like, well, you don't know, maybe you'll get something worse.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well,
it,
tyrannicide, I mean, if you're in a completely lawless society like Nazi Germany, I think it can be justified under just war theory. But the thing is like, if you're living in a democratic republic in which we can settle these things in peaceful manner, that's just never going to, that the proportionalities are all thrown out of whack, like that you get for double effect reasoning.
yeah, and you don't want to recommend tyrannicide in the Mirror of Princes.
But yeah, that's right.
Prince ain't gonna read it.
Yeah, that's
You're like,
right.
you want me dead?
That's right.
Where's
I
this
mean, when
guy?
Suarez and Mariana uh, defended tyrannicide, their books were banned in different countries. So
Yeah, it's like if
mm.
you do that, they're being like, oh, we're gonna strategically place a rock by the road so that when he falls off, he'll hit his head on it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so
That was a Thomas Aquinas dying joke, which is definitely deep in the episode, because that's how he died. Think of all that weight coming down on his skull.
Oof.
I probably weigh as much as Aquinas did. That's what's messed
Well,
up. Is
there's
Liberalism is heavy, but
my understanding is there's debate about whether they call him the dumb ox. Um, there's debate whether he was just big boned or if he was fat because
yeah.
as a Dominican he had to walk by foot on all those journeys. He couldn't use a horse, so
Yeah, that's right. Oh, he couldn't use a horse. Okay, maybe
so
that
he had
story about him's false then.
yeah. So I'm saying is like so imagine him walking from Naples to Paris or something like that. Whatever
He
it's
got his steps in. So he might have just been a husky guy.
yeah, probably just big boned.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it was more like he was like a heavyweight boxer, sort of kind of had a tummy on him.
Yeah. I mean,
Don't
and then
mess
some
with
people
Thomas.
claim like that his desk was cut out such to make for his stomach, but I think that's a myth. I think he probably just was a convenient place where he could do all his work. Um, surrounded on all sides. But
Yeah.
anyways,
What would Aquinas say about Ozempic, Tom?
what's that?
What would Aquinas say about Ozempic?
Ozempic? I
Do you know
don't.
what that is?
Is that one that helps you lose weight?
Yes, that's what I'm counting on because moderation's not going to happen.
Oh, okay. Um.
I was going for a joke here, Tom, and you didn't know what Ozempic is because you're a physically fit young man.
Oh, okay.
So
Well, I'll have to think about that a little bit more.
that's right. I'm waiting for that article to come out. That's clickbait. But that's all we got on Brazil. It's not as much detail as we got with some of the aspects of Portugal, but it's the same thing that happens. I don't know what it is about the Lusitanian connection, as it's called, but the Lusitanian, both the Portuguese and the Brazilians, tell the Integralists to take a hike,
Hmm.
and handled in the same way. Salazar had his Integralist opponents arrested and exiled, and Vargas did the same,
Hmm.
and almost paid for it. I should mention that I forgot to mention that like there was actually like an attempted coup on Vargas by the Integralists. That should have been in there, but
Wow.
yeah, it's nuts, man. There's
So,
so
James,
much more.
would
That's
you
such like
say that there's a
a key
bright
point.
integralist future?
And Brazil?
No, in the world, like, are we going to have a integralist renaissance?
No.
Oh, okay, okay. Well, I'm.
Integralism is a product of the French Revolution. And as important as that was, and as much of the impact we're having it now, like when we think about places where there's like rising Catholic numbers that might be able to affect politics, and the same kind of conditions where there's not a lot of political order and literacy, like what are we talking about? Are we talking about like little populations in like sub-Saharan Africa? Nobody
Mhm.
there wants this,
Yeah,
right? For them, the Catholic Church is a source of spiritual salvation and public order.
yeah,
The last thing they want is some like Judeo-Masonic conspiracy. You know,
yeah,
they're trying not to get kidnapped by Boko Haram. All right, like they've got problems, real problems.
yeah,
That's in
yeah,
Nigeria, obviously not Uganda.
yeah. I'm more concerned in the short term. I think with them doing a bunch of damage by trying their integration from within. I guess, but
Yeah, I mean, and a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, that really did feel much more imminent because, as we talked about with Kevin, Vance is a post-liberal. He's declared himself to be one,
hmm,
and was on a ticket that was presumptively going to win
hmm,
because Joe Biden is manifestly unfit to run for office, which makes him manifestly unfit to be president. But no one
hmm,
seems to want to make him leave. They're just going to kind of ride it out and hope that Iran doesn't make good on its 9 promises to attack Israel.
hmm,
Which is something you would need to have a president handle.
hmm,
But now with Harris and Walls replacing him on the
hmm,
ticket, the prospect of that future is much dimmer.
hmm.
And Vance, while he's kind of finally gotten his sea legs, is still saying weird stuff. Like there was the leaked comment that he said about postmenopausal females.
Or at least
Uh,
the person interviewing him said that, and he kind of went along with it.
oh, okay. Yeah. See, that's the thing is that like Vance has said enough weird stuff that when people are using dirty tricks on him, the automatic conclusion isn't oh, they're playing dirty tricks on him. It's like, oh, he must have said that, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Although all the Facebook archive dumping that they're doing, where like he's like drunk, or there was some picture of
yeah,
him
yeah.
like in
That
a
stuff's
men's
all
bathroom
stupid.
with the
There's
girls
enough.
pretending to pee.
Yeah,
I was like, dude, just he was in high school. I mean,
yeah.
like,
No, everybody our age and younger is going to have stuff like that that they can find. Um,
I
so I can
just missed it.
yeah.
Although, like, some of my graduate school stuff is there, I think,
Okay.
on Facebook. So I will be deleting. Um, it's too late now, right? It's archived by
Oh, it
somebody.
is okay.
It's occasionally when we get in these online fights on Twitter, I've discovered what screen caps people have from stuff that I've said. Like
Okay.
Helen Andrews had like a screen cap of a really incendiary statement I made about integralism and a book review I did at Kevin's. Um, and a colleague of mine came down the hall and he's like, "Dude, that's just too far. Just I'm an integralist. I don't think that I should have to, have to read this." And I'm like, you know what? You're right. I'm probably channeling a little too much of my own personal sort of like, because I've been personally affected by this stuff a lot.
Hmm.
And so I amended the piece on his advisement. It's Daniel Lenman. He's a really wonderful man.
Hmm.
And then she was like, "Why did you change this?" And I was like, well, I guess people noticed. People
Oh, yeah.
notice.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the equivalent of me being passed out drunk. JD Vance being passed out drunk is my equivalent is that I ghost edited something. I didn't realize that they weren't going to mention it at the bottom of the review, but it is what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess and yeah, to be fair, we're friends with a lot of post liberals, although some of them are kind of probably angry with us right now. Um, but yeah, a lot of them are good people. And not all of them are integralist either. Patrick Deneen's not an integralist. Although, like the integralist, he opposes things like liberal democracy and checks and balances and all in capitalism. So,
Yeah, that's why, you can kind of like the Venn diagram of post-liberalism and integralism isn't one where they don't quite overlap. It's rather that like post-liberalism is a bigger circle, and
mhm,
then a slightly smaller circle inside that circle is integralism.
mhm, that's right.
And so Deneen is in that sort of liminal space there, and I'm not sure if he can really articulate what his disagreements are. I mean, he did that discussion with um Glad and Papin, Adrian Vermeule, and Philip Munoz
Hmm.
at the that conference they do at Notre Dame every fall. I've suddenly forgotten the name of the Nicola conference. And he hemmed and hawed, but he never really explained what it is that he really disagreed with.
Yeah. Although he does, I guess, in regime change talk, uh, say something positive about religious liberty, I guess. So I guess religious liberty is not really is something he actually believes in, even if he supports institutional frameworks that are going to put it in danger, I think.
Yeah, that's more complicated than what he can endorse.
Hmm.
If you're going to have a form of public or confessional Christianity, this necessarily means that you're going to have Sunday closures. And if you're going to have Sunday closures, that means you're going to deprive Jews of
Hmm.
business, because Jews do not have Sunday closure obligations. They have Saturday closure obligations.
So
And
then
so
they have to
now,
be closed 2 days.
and then you have the house goy, but now they're having to incur costs
Hmm.
to employ someone they would not otherwise have to employ, and that competitors do not have to employ.
Hmm.
And all of this stuff has already been dealt with. I did a review of Sorba Mari's Unbroken Thread. It was a very long review for Law and Liberty, and one of the things I go through is that like the only thing Sunday closure laws actually did in places like New York was provide opportunities for police to shake down Jews.
Hmm.
They
Hmm.
would go into area, Jews wouldn't close on Sundays, and then police would go in and say, "Hey, I noticed you're not closed. It'd be a shame if someone were to put you in jail for that, or to fine
Hmm.
you for that." And so the police would take. So
Hmm.
that's how you get a little extra spending money.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks a lot, James. This is awesome. Now I know a lot more about Brazilian integralism. That was
I
quite
can't
a
believe I forgot the coup.
yeah. No, the coup, but
There's
man,
so many coups.
when you told me that they were collaborating with Nazis or whatever, I was like, wow, I couldn't, holy buckets.
That
Yeah,
will not be the last Nazi collaboration with Integralist
no,
story
no,
on
no, it
this
won't.
podcast. There
Yeah,
are many more.
yeah, that's right. Well,
We
I
got
think next week we're gonna try to have. We're gonna have Daniel DiMartino on here then?
yeah, we'll talk with Daniel. It'll be issues related to post-liberalism, especially with respect to immigration, and we might go off the reservation of the podcast a little bit, maybe to talk about Venezuela.
Oh yeah, that'd be good. Cool. All right.
Yeah,
Well, want to
I
lead
just
us
don't
out?
want us to get. I don't want us to lose sight. We're like laser focused here,
Yeah,
but Daniel's a great guy, and we'll want to talk to him.
sounds good.
All right, everybody. You've been watching or listening to the Why Post Liberalism Failed podcast. I'm James Patterson. Thank you to Thomas. And thank you to all of the scholars out there who are doing the great work on which we can depend. People like William McCormick, Leandro Gonzalez, Odilon Neto, Paul Preston, and Enrique Moradielos. This is really great stuff. Sometimes kind of bleak to read, but really great that people are doing this sort of work. So we'll see you next week.